Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. I begin with the name of God, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and a reading of the Kitab Al-Fatiha. It is authentically narrated from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that he said, "Whosoever of you sees an evil action, let him change it with his hand. And if he is not able to do so, then with his tongue. And if he is not able to do so, then with his heart. And that is the weakest of faith." We are gathered today under the shadow of an injustice being perpetrated as we speak, on a scale almost unprecedented in scale and intensity, on a people denied the very right to live as human beings. The plight of the Palestinians is an issue close to the hearts of many of us here in Malaysia, as it is for freedom-loving people across the world. It is a highly charged, deeply emotional issue. This strength of sentiment, this drive of conscience impels us to continue to speak and act against the horribly unjust situation that the Palestinians find themselves in. While this passion that we in Malaysia have on behalf of the Palestinians in their struggle is indeed admirable, this zeal must also be reinforced by an understanding of the more, let's say, technical aspects of the struggle. And it is in this light that we have organized tonight's event. First off, I welcome everyone to our special sharing session held here at Gerak Budaya Petaling Jaya tonight. My name is Mikael, and I will be your master of ceremony for the next couple of hours. A special welcome and thank you to the Deputy President of Pertubuhan IKRAM Malaysia, IKRAM, Encik Jusni Yusof, Chairman of Gabungan Bertindak Malaysia, GBM, Encik Sani Leong, and our distinguished guest speaker, Prof. Saul Jihad Takahashi, for gracing us with your presence. And of course, a big thank you to all our listeners tonight, joining us either in person here or online through the live streams. It's not easy, I know, to listen in on such a heavy topic on a Sunday night when the thoughts of the tasks of the coming week loom large, but may our passion for Palestine solve the specter of the Monday blues. Amin. Tonight, Pertubuhan IKRAM Malaysia, IKRAM, Gabungan Bertindak Malaysia, GBM, and the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies proudly present an opportunity for all of us to hear from someone who is both well-versed in the subject of international law, as well as possessing of years of on-the-ground personal experience in Palestine. But before we jump into this complex topic, it is apt at this juncture for us to hear first from Encik Jusni Yusof, the Deputy President of IKRAM, to inaugurate our event tonight with a few words. The stage is yours, Encik Jusni.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh and good evening. So, my brothers and sisters, both in the hall as well as online, which I believe is throughout the world. Yeah, when you're on the internet, you are throughout the world, right? So there could be some viewers from America, Europe, yeah, not just from Malaysia. Brothers and sisters, on behalf of IKRAM, Gabungan Bertindak Malaysia, GBM, by the way, I'm also the treasurer of GBM. So, as well as the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies of University of Malaya, we wish to say thank you to all of you for making the event a reality. Actually, it's been a very short notice event. I just got noted by Professor Nazari that Prof. Saul is available, and he says, if you want, we can organize something. So I quickly called IKRAM President and then Stanley, the Chairman of GPM, asking their permission basically, and they say yes. The moment they say yes, we get rolling. And I've got to get Azman, our media team, to be working on this, on the publicity and on the logistics of getting online show and so on and so forth. Thank you everybody, yeah, for making it happen, making it reality. friends, brothers and sisters, why do we have this event? Yeah, I think all of us know that the Palestine and Israel conflict is a world event. It's no longer a regional event or a war between two nations. Yeah, the United Nations, the European Union, the Organization of Islamic Conference, all have set sittings just to take stock of the event and try to make peace, in a way. This incident actually puts to test the real values and the principles of the whole world, whether we can accept such atrocities, such actions on genocide. Now, as responsible citizens of Malaysia and the world, we cannot remain oblivious to what is happening, as well as in the implications current and future. Yeah. Brothers and sisters, it seems that truth and peace is so far away. Yeah. As we are speaking, many more thousands will die. And many more thousands will suffer serious injuries. Unfortunately, the big group is women and children who are not directly involved with the war, with the atrocities. The inhuman action by Israel military is blatantly breaking international laws. But the world is, as though the world is helpless, just watching and talking and saying it should not happen, but what can we do? Now, brothers and sisters, IKRAM, GBM, and the center in UM encourages open, educative, and responsible discourse. We know that not all of us can be on the same page, but at least we are able to talk openly so that we can enhance awareness and build informed perspectives, for all sides, with the common objective of building a better world. I think that is what we share, building a better world for all. Yep. So again, brothers and sisters, thank you very much for making the time. Hopefully, sincerely hope that everybody will have a fruitful and enlightening evening together. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Encik Jusni Yusof. And if I may quote, what is happening in Palestine is a test of principle for the whole world. A very powerful phrase, a very powerful reminder for all of us actually, because as I was just speaking to Prof before this talk, decades from now, people will look back and we, if we're still around, will wonder, or will be asked even, like, where were we? What have we done? And with that, on this note, I call upon our guest speaker for tonight, actually, the main event, to take to the stage. But before I do, a short introduction is in order. To be perfectly honest, going through Prof. Takahashi's resume would probably constitute a talk on its own. So I will unfortunately have to give only a short summary, which may indeed not do justice to the man. Prof. Saul Jihad Takahashi is currently a professor in Osaka Jogakuin University and held the position of Deputy Head of Office for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Palestine Office in 2009 to 2014. During those 5 years, he had on-the-ground experience putting into practice his training as a human rights lawyer to advocate for the human rights of the Palestinians. His areas of research, besides Palestine specifically, include international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and Islamophobia, and more. As a manifestation of this interest, Professor Takahashi has written numerous books and publications on these matters. So without further ado, I call upon Professor Saul Jihad Takahashi to share with us a talk titled, Can International Law Help Palestinians Gain Their Rights? Tafadhal, Professor.
somehow it'll work, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks very much for that introduction and for that very powerful speech. Very difficult acts to follow, I have to say. But I, of course, do a lot of these talks on Palestine, and I really must be disciplined in my time management. Actually, what I'm going to do is take off my watch and I'm going here, so I can just make sure that I don't go overboard, because I could talk for 90 minutes. I could talk for the rest of the night on human rights in Palestine. So I must be very disciplined. I think probably most of us have seen these maps and have a general idea of what they mean and what they are, and what is it they mean. But I always start, I teach about Palestine, of course, in my university, and in those lectures, and of course in all these public talks, and I always go back to these maps. I always start with these maps, because I do believe it's really important to recall the fundamental injustice that the Palestinian people have suffered and continue to suffer, of course. But the best way to convey that is really by using these maps. Now, a few sort of fundamental mistruths, lies, basically, that are often propagated about Palestine. And I'm going to try to, there are many of those, of course, but a few fundamental ones I'm going to try to sort of go through those, just a couple of them already at the beginning, and I'm going to try to shatter them. Now, I'm not going to go back to thousands and thousands of years ago, don't worry. I'm not going to go back to biblical history, because we really don't have to. The whole notion that this is a religious war, a clash of religions, is just not true. And it's something which is quite fundamental to, in particular, the Israeli narrative, because that's what they want people to think. They want people to think that, this is all based on religion. And, Muslims just hate Jewish people and have this irrational and terrible fear of Jews. And that's why Muslims, attack Jews, peace-loving Jewish state of Israel, right? And we see that we've all seen that. I mean, if you're watching the English language media, Al Jazeera, of course not, but for example, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, if you're watching these kind of outlets, then you see this propagated over and over again, of course, ever since 7th of October. I'm sure many of you have heard this notion that this is, the 7th of October attacks by Hamas it was the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, which is, I mean, it may or may not be true. In a numerical sense, I don't know, but I mean, comparing 6 million and 1,200, first of all, is pretty ridiculous. And more to the point, the Holocaust took place because the Germans, the Nazis, they were killing Jews because they were Jews, and for no other reason. Now, Hamas was killing, however many Israelis, not because they were Jews, it's because they were brutal colonizers that were taking their land and that were, bombing them to kingdom come and starving them almost to death in Gaza. And we'll get to that. I mean, I'll go through the details, but it has nothing to do with the fact that they're Jews. I mean, this is ridiculous. So, this is the kind of sort of narrative that they want you to think. They want you to believe this. They want you to think that this is some kind of religious conflict, because that also makes people think, it makes people feel they are helpless. It makes people feel, oh, it's a religious thing, so, we can't do anything about it. Maybe not so much in this country, but in Japan, this is a very common thing. So like, oh, Japanese who are not Muslim or Jewish or Christian, they just feel, oh, well, I don't understand any of this. It's a religious thing, and this has been going on for thousands of years, and, we can't do anything about it. So it's to make you feel helpless and to make you think that this is, to make you, refrain from commenting on it, right? So this is all just not true. Basically, it's a lie. Really, religion has very little, frankly, almost nothing to do with it. The Palestinian conflict, and I use that word with a lot of hesitation, I'll go back to that, but the situation we have now really goes back just over 100 years. This is a pretty recent conflict, and it's a very sort of traditional conflict over land and resources. That's what it is, right? Now, I'm not going to go, I said I would not go back to biblical times, and I won't, but there is just one reference I want to make, which is the so-called exodus of people of the Jewish faith from Palestine, which took place, a couple of thousand years ago. Now, I'm not going to go into why this happened or whether it really, happened or all this kind of thing, whether the Romans really did kick people of the Jewish faith out of Palestine, because this is, there are a lot of archaeological evidence to suggest that it wasn't as far-reaching and fundamental as the Israeli narrative would want you to think. But the most important thing is that people of the Jewish faith, a lot of them left Palestine for whatever reason, and they became the diaspora, right? Now, many of them went to Africa, went to other parts of the Middle East, went to other parts of Asia. There is still a very large Jewish community in Iran, believe it or not, something that the Israelis don't want anybody to know. So most of these Jewish people, they moved to various different countries. Some of them maintained their religion and maintained their sort of identity as a community. Many of them didn't, and they just sort of faded away. That's just how these things happen. Now, you'll notice that I use the term people of the Jewish faith as opposed to Jews or Jewish people. And I try to do that especially when I'm talking about this era, because at that time, look, Judaism was a faith, like Islam, like Christianity. It was a universal religion. You believed in it, you were part of the community. You did not believe in it, you were not. I mean, it was just as simple as that. And of course, as Muslims, we know this because in reading the Quran, there are stories of the Prophet and of his followers getting into battles with Jewish people. And they were Arabs. They spoke Arabic, and they just, for whatever reason, they happened to be members of the Jewish faith at that point in time. So it was a religion, right? It was a religion. So you had these people who believed in the Jewish faith. They all sort of scattered all over the place. Basically, they faced very little problem in pretty much everywhere they went, except the people who went to Europe. And we'll get to that. But the people who the people who left Palestine, what happened was they bumped into all sorts of other people, sort of like in Central Asia and sort of Eastern Europe, and they propagated their faith, which is what we do. Muslims do this, Christians do this, because it was a universal religion, they propagated the faith, and so people converted to Judaism along the way. And those were the people who ended up in Europe. And I say this really, I stress this fact because it's important to understand that the people who came to Palestine later on in the 20th century have ethnically no connection with the people who left Palestine thousands of years ago. There is, and this is substantiated by all sorts of sort of DNA type research. There's very little, if any, connection at all with the people who left Palestine. So, but it was still a faith at the time. It was a religion, right? But what happened was, so these people, they went on and they in Central Asia and they propagated the faith. And those people who converted to Judaism, they went to Europe. Now, what happened was these people who went to Europe, they are the only ones of the diaspora who faced any problem. Nobody else faced it. This is a problem, an issue that was created solely in Europe, solely by the European Christians, right? So you have these Jewish people, they become minorities in Europe, and they are faced with centuries of discrimination and persecution. And, this was not a linear thing, and it depended on the country and depended on the time and which ruler was there and all this kind of thing. But the point is, there was this sort of ongoing persecution of people of the Jewish faith. And as they were being persecuted and as Europeans came up with these nifty sort of racist philosophies, what happened was the Jews sort of transformed from a religious group to a race. They were racialized. This is what we say in academia, right? So it's like you're born as a Jew. your blood is that of a Jew, right? And you are therefore, you're born into this, you can't change it, and you are born as an enemy, we can't trust you, you are a fifth column, you are a potential traitor, and so that's why we persecute. Right? So they were racialized, they became a race. And in the course of this persecution, many of them also started believing in themselves as a race. That's how these kind of things work. Right? So, you have this group in Europe that were racialized and started thinking of themselves as an ethnic group and not only a religion. I'm talking in very simplistic terms here, but that's basically what happened. And over the centuries of persecution, it just got, again, it was not a linear thing, and there were times when it was really bad and times not so bad, but it was an ongoing sort of process of discrimination and persecution. And towards the end of the 19th century, there a number of very educated Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Eastern Europe, they came up with this idea called Zionism. They created this political philosophy, which in essence is a Jewish nationalism, if you like, right? The idea being that, look, no matter what happens, we as Jews will remain persecuted wherever we go in Europe. So what we need is we need a state of our own. That is the only way we are going to be safe, right? So just as the French have France, just as the English have England, we will create a Jewish state. And that is the only way that we as a nation will be able to protect ourselves and be safe and flourish. That was the idea. And at the beginning, it didn't even have to be Palestine, actually. The early sort of Zionist leaders were talking about Uganda and Argentina, and there were all these sort of zany ideas, and you will kind of wonder how history would have changed had they pursued those. They did try to pursue them, but like with Uganda, the Brits just said, forget it, it's not going to happen. And that just wasn't, it just didn't happen. And of course, there was a religious sort of faction within the early Zionist movement, and they said, look, this is where we are from. This is where our ancestors came from. Now, mind you, that's not true. Ethnically, it's simply not true, but because they had been racialized into thinking that they were an ethnic group, they already had this idea that their physical ancestors came from Palestine. And so it came to be, and so they're saying, okay, well, look, Palestine is where it's at. Palestine is where we're going to go. We're going to go to Palestine, and we're going to make a state of our own. It will be a Jewish state. Yeah? And of course, they were not dumb. I mean, they knew, the early Zionist leaders, of course, knew that there were 1 million plus people living there, the indigenous Palestinians, an Arab, ethnic group was living there. They knew this, but to them, they were just like, oh well, they're just savages. I mean, we're just going to go in, we'll just take their land. They don't really own the land like we do, because we're civilized Europeans. We're just going to go and take them, and just that's what we do. And I'm not defending this by any way, but I do think we have to understand it. This was the late 19th century, and these are educated, upper-class Europeans, essentially. All of this was being done in German. None of these people spoke Hebrew. Hebrew just was not spoken at the time. Some of them spoke Yiddish, which is a mishmash of Hebrew and German and Polish and Russian. But none of the Hebrew just wasn't spoken. All of these debates were taking place in European language. These were Europeans. They were born and raised in Europe, and were educated as upper-class Europeans. And if you saw them, they're white-skinned and blonde and blue-eyed, and they're Europeans. And for the European sort of upper class at the time, this was how they thought. I mean, this was the time when European countries were going around colonizing the rest of the world, stealing their land, stealing their resources, brutally massacring the indigenous peoples, using them as slaves, et cetera, et cetera. This was colonization. I don't need to tell you people here in Malaysia what that is about. And this was, so from their perspective, this was a completely natural sort of thought process. Yeah, there are people living there, but, they're not civilized people like we are. We have European civilization. As a matter of fact, and some of them actually seem to have thought this, they're going to be thankful to us for bringing European civilization. Yeah, and if they're not, we'll just kick them off the land. I mean, this is our land, this is our country. They don't own the land like we modern people do. They're just they don't count. They just don't count. That was the idea. And so they started going to Palestine, migrating to Palestine, and colonizing the land. And, colonialization at time was not a dirty word like it is now. You say this now, I mean, the Israelis, the Zionists, the United States, they're going to go crazy. But at the time, this was not a dirty word. And again, if you look at the writings of the early Zionists, they're very open about it. We are going to go, we are going to colonize the land. We're going to settle, plop our stuff down. We're going to colonize the land. And if the people, the indigenous, the natives, if they don't like it, we'll just kick them off the land, and they can go somewhere else. I mean, this is our country. We're advanced, modern Europeans. And this is all very twisted, and the psychology of this, I could talk about that for half an hour, but the psychology of this is all very sort of twisted and very sort of interesting, because we have a people who are in Europe, they are deemed as not white. Jews were not white in the eyes of Europeans at the time. And yet, in their mind, somehow, they are an advanced European race, and they're going to go and colonize this savage land and make the desert bloom. So it's all very twisted and weird. But the point is, you have these colonizers coming in from Europe, right? And at the beginning, it was sort of okay, because people were sort of migrating in a very on an individual basis. And they would come and they would buy land, but they would learn Arabic and they would get along fine with their Palestinians. Everything was fine. But it started, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, people started coming in a much more organized fashion, and it was led by much more sort of extremist factions within the Zionism. And so the idea was, we're going to buy all the land, we're going to take all the land, we're going to kick the Palestinians out, and we're going to make this land, a Jewish state just for us. A state populated by Jews, for Jews, only with Jews. That was the general idea. And it's just shaping more and more into this kind of exclusivist Jewish state in the minds of the Jews. Right? So this is getting more and more extreme and getting more and more tense with the indigenous Palestinian population. There are more and more, there's more tension and more sort of battles and the like. So after World War II, the Ottomans flopped, and then this became administered by the Brits. But after World War II, the British Empire is completely exhausted and just, they can't handle this anymore. So what they do is they give the file to the United Nations, right? And the United Nations at the time, remember, was not what we have now. I mean, this was 1947, right? So this is right after World War II. The number of member states in the UN was 55, 56, something like that. Predominantly Western states, because the Asian and African colonies had still not attained independence. So they were not part of this discussion at all, right? So they give this file to the UN, and long story short, the UN basically comes out with a resolution in 47. Now, if you look at the map on the left, this is what Palestine looked like in reality at the time, right? So the green is land that's owned by Palestinians. So this is like 93% of the land, right? 93% of the land is owned by Palestinians. And the population is also about, more than two-thirds, it's about like 70% of the population is Palestinian, right? The Zionist colonizers were only under one-third. They only owned a very small proportion of the land. That's what it looked like. Now, the map on the right hand is what the partition resolution, the map in the partition resolution looked like this. So the UN comes along and they say, okay, you guys, you own 93% of the land, so I got a great idea. Why don't you just give 50% of your country over to these Europeans? That's a good idea. Yeah, and then we'll have two states. We'll have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state side by side, living in peace and security. So all you have to do is, you just give up half of your country. Not a big deal, right? So if you're a Palestinian, you're looking at this and say, well, what's going on here? What is going on here? This is not what we signed up for. I mean, this is, why should we give half of our country over to these foreign colonizers? Because that's what they are. They are foreign colonizers coming from Europe, right? So this is really, and that's why I really always start off the talks with these two maps, because it shows the clear injustice that was basically imposed upon the Palestinian people. So the Palestinians did not accept this, the Zionists did, and then war breaks out, 48, right after they declare the state of Israel. And what happens is Israel, I think it's in the next, So Israel basically takes even more than had been allotted to them in the partition resolution. Essentially, so I think most of the people here know this, already from the time of the partition resolution, late 47, through the war in May 1948, when Israel declared itself a state, basically the Nakba takes place. So you have Zionist militias roaming around with weapons, burning villages, killing to new Jewish migrants. Right? This is how it works. This is how it's worked since 1948, and this is how it continues to work. Right? This is basically, a lot of people say this, and I say it too. The Nakba has never ended. Right? This was just the beginning of this long process of settler colonialism to expel the Palestinians from their land and take it over. Right? I mean, this is what the European settlers did in North America, Latin America, population, take over their land for yourself. That's really what this is. And Israel is a settler colonial state. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Again, so I'm just going to skip this. We have this apartheid system, which relies on systematic human rights violations, oppressing the Palestinian people at every turn. And, I don't really have time to sort of go into great detail about, the tremendous violations that the Palestinian people face in every walk of their lives. But just to give like one example, essentially, different laws apply to you if you are a Palestinian or if you are a Jewish Israeli. So all throughout the West Bank, Israel has embarked on a long and never-stopping process of colonization. Steals land from Palestinian people and builds Israeli-only cities. Jewish They are cities. Yeah, all built on stolen Palestinian land and all only for the benefit of the Jewish population. Right? Now, if you are, and this is all, of course, a violation of international law, a blatant violation of international law, right? Colonized Palestinian land in blatant disregard of international law. But anyway, so these shouldn't even be there. But if you are an Israeli settler, a colonial settler, living in one of these cities in the West Bank, right? You're not even supposed to be there, but just put that aside for a second. If you commit a crime, then you will be arrested by the Israeli police. You will be afforded all the rights that one would expect. So you're like access to a lawyer. You will be given parole, as presumed to be given parole. You know, all these kind of rights which one would expect in any kind of country, right? And you will be tried under normal Israeli civil law. If you're a Palestinian, then you are tried in Israeli military courts under military law, right? And of course, the nature, the content of these laws is completely different. Like, for example, if you are Israeli, you have criminal responsibility as an adult only after you reach the age of 18, right? And that is normal. That is how it should be under international law. That's how it should be. If you're Palestinian, it's from 14 that you have criminal responsibility. And in reality, it's even worse because, I'm sure, you can all see the videos on the internet, and I can assure you they're all true. Children as young as 12, 10 are regularly arrested by Israeli military troops, hauled into Israeli military detention, beaten up, tortured, etc., and put on trial in a military court. Right? So different laws apply to you according to your race. Now, this is Apartheid 101. These are the fundamentals of apartheid. Yeah, different laws for different people. And this is the reality in the West Bank. And it is, it's not hidden or anything. It's all very open. If you are a Palestinian, you are subject to Israeli military law. It's very clear, right? And, there are just this litany of human rights abuses, which I could speak for hours and hours about. We don't have time to do that. But really, the whole objective here is to, drive Palestinians off their land and to destroy Palestine as a nation, destroy the Palestinians as a national group, right? And again, like all settler colonial states, that's what they do. And you have here, just to, really quickly, the four sort of categories of Palestinians that we see, right? So you have Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank and Gaza are, of course, also somewhat different situations, but you have these, they are subject to military rule and they are under occupation, a brutal occupation at the hands of the Israeli military. East Jerusalem has been, immediately after having been taken over by the Israelis in 1967, was illegally annexed and held to be part of Israel, right? So this is completely illegal under international, right? Almost no country recognizes this, and that's why it was such a big deal when Trump did recognize it. You remember this, 2017, I think it was. And that's why this was such a big deal, because almost no country in the world had recognized Jerusalem as as the capital of Israel, right? And that's why the step taken by Trump and the Americans was such a grave thing, right? Now in East Jerusalem, you have like 360K. I have the number here. These people have been living on that land for generations. Some of them have been living there, since before the state of Israel ever came into existence, right? But Israel takes over. Israel unilaterally announces that Jerusalem is part of Israel. So Israeli law is, in theory, applied in East Jerusalem. And Palestinians who are living there are given residency status. Basically, they are treated as foreigners. And like, for example, I would never do this, but if, for example, I were to go to Israel, an Israeli university, and study at an Israeli university for 2 years, I would be given residency status as a foreign student, right? And then, after 2 years, I would finish my studies and I would say goodbye and I would leave. That's the status they have, right? So if they leave Jerusalem for an extended period of time, for example, if they want to work abroad or whatever, then they will lose their residency status. And this is not an academic thing. I mean, this is something that, the Israelis do with great abandon. Over 10,000 people have lost their residency status since 1967 because of these very arbitrary regulations. Okay, refugees are, of course, refused the right to return. I mentioned that. And, this is, once again, blatant violation of international law. And in fact, Israel joining the United Nations was incumbent upon them allowing the refugees to return. And, we can't really go into the great details of that, but they managed to get out of that, and here we are. So, I have, like, when I teach about Palestine to my Japanese students, for example, a lot of my students say, these refugees, and, they've been there for so many generations, why is this? And I don't understand. It's like, yeah, well, it's really easy. It's because they can't go home. They're prohibited by the Israel from going back to their home. And you meet Palestinian refugees. I mean, I know there are many here in Malaysia. I'm sure many of you have met some of them. And, some of their families, they keep the keys. I mean, the key is the symbol of Palestinian refugeehood. Many of them left their homes with their keys to their home. And they keep their keys saying, someday I'm going to go back. Maybe they won't reclaim the land. Some of them have started to sort of accept that this is just not going to happen. But at least I want to go and see it. That was my home. That was my land. That was where I grew up, right? They have the keys to their home. Some of them have the documents of ownership to their home and land as well. But they can't go back. Even as tourists, most of them are barred from entering Palestine and seeing where they live. And then finally, we have what I call 48 Palestinians. These are Palestinians who were not ethnically cleansed for whatever reason during the Nakba, during the initial Nakba in 48. Most of them lived in predominantly Christian cities like Nazareth, Bethlehem. Well, Bethlehem is part of the West Bank, but Nazareth and the Galilee and these kind of places, because they were, the Zionists recognized that there would be a lot of European attention towards the Christian cities. So they were a little bit hesitant about doing their evil deeds in these sort of major Christian cities. And in any way, I mean, the war ended very quickly, so it was impossible to do. And these people were given, or were sort of imposed to, Israeli citizenship was imposed on them, let's put it that way. However, though they were Israeli citizens, from 48 to 66, they lived under military rule and were subject to military law. They needed permits to move from their home outside their village. In many ways, the Israelis perfected the techniques of control that they used in the West Bank by testing them on 48 Palestinians. And they're no longer under military rule. The Israelis will always point to what they call Israeli Arabs, because heaven forbid that they would use the word Palestinian. They call them Israeli Arabs, and they say, look, these people are, treated perfectly well in the state of Israel. We treat them very well, and there is no discrimination. That's, again, of course, a complete lie. In some ways, they have a better situation than people in the West Bank, for example. But they live as second-class citizens, third-class citizens. Just as an example of the discriminatory laws that they live under, they are barred from owning land. Like, they can't own land, right? So this is just one of the examples of the discrimination that they live under. So you have these four categories of Palestinians, each one of them in sort of different ways and different sort of methods have their human rights violated. and into different degrees and all that. But what is constant and clear is that by virtue of the fact that they are Palestinian, they have their rights violated. And that's why B'Tselem, this is an Israeli human rights organization, but as I'm sure you know, major human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, have recognized finally Israel to be an apartheid state. Of course, Palestinians have been saying this for decades, but yeah, whatever. I mean, the point is finally now these Western international organizations are finally getting on board. Now, I've already spoken for pretty much the entire time. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the West Bank stuff because I think people are probably, these are some of the Israeli colonies, by the way. So as you can see, these are cities, right? The Israelis, all throughout the Oslo process, I'll talk about that, have always maintained, well, they don't do it now anymore. It's just, they don't even waste their time trying to do this anymore. But for a long time, they would always maintain, look, if we strike a deal with the Palestinians, then, and they never say give back the land, but if we're going to give them this land, then, yeah, of course, we will evacuate the settlements. Of course, this is no problem. I mean, of course, no problem. But now you can see, these are not built with evacuation in mind. These are cities. These are not trailer parks. These are cities. And 700,000 Jewish Israelis live in these colonies. Right? So that's how normal this is. This is like 1 in 10, 1 in 11 Jewish Israelis. Right? So that's how normal this is. From the Israeli perspective, these are just sort of cities that are a bit far out into the countryside. Right? That's how these things work. And the Israeli government, again, constant process of colonization, have made it very attractive for Israelis to move to the colonies. Like all colonial governments have done this, eh? Japan did it. When we colonized Korea and Manchuria and all this, we would like dish out land to Japanese who wanted to move there. Same kind of thing, right? So getting a mortgage on a home here is like tax-free, right? And you can get tax-free car loans. The schools are good because, there are fewer children in each classroom. It is this kind of very mundane thing which encourages, young couples building a new life. They think, yeah, this is good. The housing is cheap and it's, the housing is a very high standard of living compared to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Let's do it. That's what happened, right? And so that's how these colonies have grown and grown and grown. And, never have the Israelis stopped. Never. Never have the Israelis stopped building these colonies. I mean, it's just never happened. There have been sort of occasional announcements suggesting that they will do this when the Americans get a little bit angry, but they've never done. There have always been loopholes, there have always been excuses, and they've never stopped. Right? There's been this constant process of increase of colonies. And this is the West Bank. This is a website, I think if I remember, this is a UK organization, again, encouraging British Jews to migrate to Israel. Basically this is one of these sort of words, very, very open, right? It doesn't say colony, eh? But it doesn't say West Bank either. Why don't you want to, be a Jew and live as a Jew in Israel, and you could live in this, you'll notice what it says, a well-planned community. This is what they call them, communities or neighborhoods. Right? Now this is a colony. This is a colony that's built, this is deep in the West Bank, built completely on stolen Palestinian land. And here they are advertising it to British Jews as an attractive place to go live. So, this is the openness, the brazenness in which this takes place. But I'm going to skip the West Bank stuff because I'm pretty sure people are very curious about Gaza and what's happening there. This is apartheid. Okay, so, everybody I'm sure is following the news and following the developments in Gaza and knows what's happening. Last I checked, it was over 16,000 Palestinians killed, but of course, many thousands are still stuck under the rubble. So we just don't know. I've seen 20,000. I've seen the estimate of 20,000. And it is a litany of war crimes, just a litany of clear and obvious war crimes. I mean, what Israel is doing, up till now, when there were these major military offensives, often the Israelis would at least make an effort to sort of try to show that these were not war crimes, that they attacked them because they were Hamas headquarters or whatever. And they did this with the hospitals because there was such criticism of that. But this time, and most of the time, they don't even bother. This time, they're not even bothering to sort of pretend that they're trying to avoid civilian casualties. And they're not. I mean, it's obvious. I'm sorry. Even supposing these places that they are attacking were like Hamas military, bases and military facilities, even supposing, that's, the number of civilian casualties is so clearly, so obviously disproportionate to any kind of military advantage that they are getting, that it is clear it is a war crime. And in fact, just yesterday, or perhaps it was the day before yesterday, an Israeli NGO got its hands on some leaked military documents showing that the way that the Israeli military had been planning attacks changed at a certain point a couple of years ago. And that basically they are much more casual about avoiding civilian casualties and much more casual about making sure that they only target military facilities, right? Not to mention the total closure of Gaza, no food, no water. I mean, we all know, we were following the developments. A clear and obvious war crime. Again, no way you can get out of it. There's simply no way. There's simply no way that this could be justified. Had Russia been doing this in Ukraine, can you imagine what would be going on? We'd be watching World War III right now. So, but anyway, we'll get to the double standards, inshallah, at some point. But I want to stress, of course, and I think a lot of people here, are probably aware of this, but, history did not begin on 7th of October. And there's a whole context to what was going on. And this is what I just want to go through very quickly. In 1993, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this, the Oslo Accords were announced. And under this, so you had various different Palestinian groups that were fighting the Israelis. And they've been doing this, of course, for a long time. These are independence movements that are fighting for their country, right? Sometimes they use methods which are problematic from the perspective of the laws of war. So this is something which, should be criticized. But, I challenge anybody to find a country which has got independence without using these kind of methods. In any case, what had happened in 93 was, out of the blue, the Oslo Accords are announced, in which Fatah, which was the main sort of Palestinian group that was the core of the PLO at the time, they agreed, they basically entered into an agreement with Israel. They denounced armed resistance unilaterally. They unilaterally denounced armed resistance, and they agreed to enter into negotiation with Israel, aiming towards the creation of a Palestinian state. So this is the two-state solution again, right? Enter in negotiation with Israel only on 22% of their land. So that's the 67 territories, West Bank and Gaza. With East Jerusalem, that is something they insisted on, but this was, all of this was subject to negotiation. But basically, they already announced their red line. They were abandoning armed resistance, and they were abandoning their claim to all of Palestine. Right? That's what happened. Now, this was completely out of the blue. This was not something that was like democratically decided, right? This was, all the negotiations took place in secret, and completely out of the blue, this is announced. Right? Many of the other Palestinian groups, certainly at first, were unhappy with this. They did not accept it. But it was a fait accompli, and this fait accompli, was accompanied by part of the agreement was that the Palestinian Authority, with limited autonomy, would be created, basically staffed by Fatah, in the West Bank and Gaza. Right. So basically, abandoning armed resistance, agreeing to only aiming for a Palestinian state on 22% of the land, and in turn, as a reward, then they will be given a certain measure of autonomy as the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority, lest we forget, one of the main functions of the Palestinian Authority, the PA, is to engage in security cooperation with Israel. What this euphemism means is that, okay, remember, they have abandoned armed resistance. And anybody who continues armed resistance, like people from the other armed groups, within the West Bank or Gaza, basically the PA, instead of Israel going in and arresting people and having stones thrown at them and all this kind of messy stuff. They just call their buddies in the PA, and the PA does it for them, right? So you have the PA going around arresting Palestinians, throwing them in the clink, torturing them, instead of the Israelis, right? So basically, in the eyes of most Palestinians, these are collaborators. This is a puppet government set up by the colonial oppressor to, give it the facade of Palestinian rule. That's basically what it is, right? Now, so this is what the PA is, and from the get-go, they don't have much credibility. But because Yasser Arafat was still head of the place, it sort of cobbled along. Then you had the Second Intifada, things are falling apart, things are not going well. Now, but the PA, again, sort of cobbling along. Now, 2006, there is an election for the Palestinian Authority. There's a legislature, there's a legislature of the PA, and there's an election in 2006. The Americans and the Israelis are all behind this. They think this is they think this is fantastic, right? Oh yeah, we're going to show, these savages, we're going to let them hold elections, right? But they're going to vote for the people we want them to vote for. Yeah, it's going to be no problem because these Arabs, they don't know what democracy is. They're just going to vote for the village honchos, right? They're just going to vote for the tough guys from the village, i.e. Fatah. So it's going to be it's really easy. This is going to rubber stamp the PA, and it's going to be. So you have the elections in 2006, and it was completely fair, free and fair. I mean, there are international observers every 50 meters. No serious reports of any serious problems with the election. Frankly, this was much better than U.S. presidential elections, right? It was absolutely no problem. And so they opened the box, and what happens? Fatah is completely defeated by Hamas, which is another political party which has never accepted the Oslo Accords, never accepted the concessions made by Fatah, right? So, of course, you have the Americans and the Israelis and the Europeans and also the Japanese, and, they're saying, well, we don't really like this, we don't really like what happened here, but of course this is the democratic election, and this was the freely expressed will of the Palestinian people, so I guess we're just going to have to accept it. We don't have a choice. No, of course not. Of course not. So what happens is they instantly cut off all funds to the PA. They boycott it and say, we're not going to play with you guys because we didn't, democracy is fine when our guys win, right? So they're instantly cut off. And then they go to Fatah and they say, look, why don't you we'll give you the guns, just, smash them, just do it. We'll look the other way. Remember what happened with Sisi? Yeah, same thing. Yeah, well, just do it. Go ahead and do it. So Fatah goes in. I mean, Gaza is really the main city here. And so Fatah and Hamas get into these shootouts in Gaza. Fatah can't win elections and they can't win a battle. So basically they're kicked out. And they are kicked out and they run they run tail in hand to the West Bank. So that's why we have this situation with Fatah and the PA in the West Bank and the Hamas-run PA in Gaza. So that's why we have the situation where we have two parties in the two areas, the two different regions of Palestine, of 67 Palestine, right? And, if you read the Western media, it's the same with the Japanese media. It's like the PA is the internationally recognized representative of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and Gaza is this is what we used to say in the UN. Hamas is the de facto authority in Gaza, not internationally recognized, not legitimate. But they're even written like they took over through a coup, an armed coup. These are all lies. This is just simply not true, right? This is just not true. They won through an election. The Americans and Israelis, and the Europeans didn't like it, tried to oppress them, and they were kicked out. That's how it worked. So we have the situation where they are boycotting the Hamas government in Gaza to this day, right? And the Americans refuse to talk with them. I mean, look at, and the Israelis refuse to talk with them. So look, you have to talk through the Qataris when you want to do these kind of ceasefire deals or these mediation, right? That's why we have these separate governments in Gaza. And immediately, the Israelis start a blockade of Gaza, right? So this is the situation that Gazans have been living with since 2007, where people are not allowed out, and nothing is allowed in terms of goods. Very little very severe restrictions, very arbitrary. The UN, was trying to take stuff in all the time, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. One day this was allowed, the next day it was not. Very arbitrary, but very severe. And certainly at a certain point, the Israeli military was calculating the number of calories that the Gazan population required, not to starve. And the idea was to allow only as much food in so that they wouldn't starve, but just keep them above the starvation line. But we don't want them happy. We don't want them, content and plump or anything. We want them, just above starvation line. Because if people are starving to death, people are going to start, the rest of the world is going to start criticizing Israel. So we don't want that, but we want them very unhappy so that somehow they are going to, they're going to go to an uprising and they're going to overturn Hamas. Well, dream on. That's not happening. It's not going to happen. Right? So you have this blockade. The Gazans are not allowed into the sea to fish, shot at. A buffer zone of up to 1 kilometer within Gaza is also closed off de facto by was closed off de facto by the Israelis. There are fences around and snipers. So people wanted to go to their farmland within 1 kilometer of the fence, and they'd be shot at by the Israelis. That's simple, right? So, can't farm, can't fish, can't export anything. So the economy basically, has collapsed. This is the order. So the economy has the economy has collapsed, and Gaza was often termed as the world's an open air prison, right? Also called a concentration camp. Now, frankly, an extermination. Now, of course, this closure is collective punishment. There's absolutely, again, clear violation of international law. Absolutely no justification for it. And as the economy has collapsed, so you have 2.3 million residents, approximately 60% were refugees, 80% relying on UN food aid, unemployment rate over 45%, no drinkable water. Electricity, just before 7th of October, I looked it up, it was up to an average 13 hours a day. But at some points, it would be like 4 hours, 8 hours, whatever. Why? This is because every time the Israelis go on one of these rampages, they bomb the plant. They bomb the electricity plant. They're not supposed to do this. This is a civilian facility, but they just go ahead and do it anyway. Now, that means that there's no electricity to the population. Now, I understand that Hamas has its own electricity generation stuff in the tunnels and everything. So they bomb the facility. It doesn't really matter. I mean, they can continue on with their military stuff. I mean, it doesn't really matter to them, right? And the Israelis are not dumb. They know this. They listen in, or they are able to listen to all the mobile phone conversations within Gaza. They have drones going overhead. They have they're listening in on everything. So they know this. And yet they still insist on bombing the electricity plant. Why? Well, to me, it's pretty clear. It's because now we live in an era of smartphones and videos and social media. They don't want these video clips being sent outside. They don't want the rest of the world to know what they are doing. And that's why, again, this time around, one of the first things they did, they cut off the electricity, right? So, really it was a stage of, it was a situation of what the UN even called de-development. So it's not going forward in terms of economic development, it's going backward, right? And already in 2012, the UN had reported, look, Gaza is going to be unlivable by 2020. Well, here we are in 2023. And the Israelis now are really making sure that it's going to be unlivable because they're destroying all the infrastructure. And again, that's the objective here. And, I think I've already sort of gone way over time. But one thing I want to say is that, settler colonial states, like I said, rely on a system of apartheid to maintain their dominance over the indigenous people. But the ultimate objective is genocide. It is to eradicate the indigenous population. Maybe not 100% physically, but that's not necessarily, it's not, not necessary. But to eradicate them as a national group, as an ethnic group, and to, leave them to, to doom them to a situation of subjugation. Now, this is the international definition of genocide. This is in the Genocide Convention and also in the Rome Statute of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. All the stuff, the actions here, it's easy. Obviously, Israel is doing it, been doing it, all the time. What international lawyers always like debating about is intent, right? With genocide, you need the intent. You need to show that there was an intent to destroy the national group, right? Now, I mean, all you need is an internet connection to find all these statements by Israeli political and military leaders. Honestly, when this all started the 7th of October, I mean, I was actually one of the ones saying, well, we have to prove intent. It's not as easy as that. But they just make it easy. I mean, it's just, one after the other. And, I'm not even talking sort of the popular discourse and, social media and this kind of thing, which is also bad. But we're talking, presidents, prime ministers, generals here. I mean, this is pretty, they're making it kind of easy here. And, but, and the other thing is, this didn't just start on 7th of October. Really, the whole, like I said before, the Nakba has never ended. And the whole process of the genocide of the Palestinian people started in 47 and perhaps even earlier, some people would argue, and is going on to this day. It's just what we're seeing now is just a very extreme manifestation. Now, I think what you mentioned at the beginning was what can we do, and it's easy to get dejected or to feel hopeless when one sees the Western governments and their craven cozying up and sucking up to the government of Israel, support for genocide in terms of weapons, in terms of political and military support, all of this kind of thing. And it is really terrible. But I just want to stress that, this is just, first of all, the international community is not only the Western countries. I'm guilty of this too. Sometimes, when I say the international community, what am I thinking about? But, really, this is not the UN of 1947, and we see governments, the government of Malaysia is one, at the governmental level, criticizing Israel and not accepting the double standards that the West is, constantly trying to impose on people. But being very critical of Israel, and, a couple of governments have even, gone, much, much further. They've recalled ambassadors. I think Bolivia cut off relations completely. This is a process which is taking place. So, outside of the West, this is really starting. But even within, the very sort of powerful and influential countries of the West, we've seen this, really amazing groundswell of support for the Palestinians, right? And this is, every time there's a military rampage and all these massacres, we've seen it. But this is just because also the massacres are unprecedented, probably. But this is really, quite amazing, unprecedented levels. And all across, Tokyo, Osaka included, Seoul, thousands and thousands of people. London was, I think, 500,000, I think. Just amazing groundswell of support, these kind of demonstrations over and over and over every week. And it's really, it's easy to sort of look at these and think, oh, yeah, but we're not the ones in power. We're not the ones with power. How can we, this doesn't make a difference. But believe me when I say that's not the case. It does make a difference. Even in the most terrible dictatorships, they rely on support of the people, or at least tacit acceptance from the people. And when the people are coming out on the streets like this, they are afraid because we are stronger. The people are stronger than the political leaders. And even, Biden, who has been a complete disaster, has changed his tune somewhat. Not enough, not nearly enough. But he's seen how the people are, furious. And a lot of the other people in his party are also, they're changing their tune because they've realized, we're going to get voted out. We're going to lose these elections. This is going to be a problem. So really, the fact that everybody is coming here and also sort of participating over the internet is already the first step to get educated, to get information about what is happening, so you can spread the word and organize politically and make your voice heard politically. I think this is really one of the important things that we can do. Of course, the boycott, BDS, boycott movement is also very important. Obviously, in Malaysia, it's a little bit different. I mean, the boycott is very important, of course, but you don't have relations with Israel, and you don't have direct relations with Israeli companies as well. So, hooray for that. But also companies that do business in Israel, but also do business in Malaysia, like foreign companies, Western companies. These are also, companies that can be boycotted and should be boycotted. Starbucks, McDonald's, and ever since 7th of October, these companies have been decimated in some countries because they've just been, completely boycotted. McDonald's, the Israeli franchise of McDonald's, was handing out free meals to Israeli soldiers. How bad is that, eh? So, so in all these other countries in the world, people are boycotting McDonald's, expressing their displeasure and all this kind of thing. So, it's very, very important, and they feel it. The State of Israel has, they've designated formally the boycott movement as an existential threat, right? They know that this is, they see the writing on the wall. They know that they have lost the war of narrative, what people call the battle for public opinion. They've lost it. I mean, now it is really, truly irreversible. I really believe that. So, I think it's just really, we have to keep on the pressure, especially on our own politicians and our own governments, to make sure that, that Israel really feels the pressure and is held accountable. Yes? So I'm sure I went ridiculously abroad, over. I'm sorry about that. But as you can see when I start talking about Palestine, this is what happens. But thank you very much, and I hope we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Beautiful talk. Thank you, Prof. Your passion for the subject shines through, overcoming even the infamous Japanese ability to stick to time. So we'll now be taking questions from the floor, actually. Anyone here in person, anyone who wants to ask questions on the live stream as well. But I'm actually going to take some liberties as the MC to ask the first question, if that's okay with everyone. Here in Malaysia, I'm not going to burden you with the political, cultural aspects of the Malaysian society, but the Palestine issue is disproportionately supported by Muslim Malaysians. I don't think it's a secret or anything controversial per se regarding that. Of course, you're a human rights lawyer, but you also speak on this issue of Palestine to non-Muslim audiences on a regular basis. So the first thing usually we jump to when we talk about Palestine to non-Muslims is a human rights issue. But how do we progress further than that? How do we get the point across that Palestine is the idea of a multiracial, harmonious society, as opposed to the Israeli vision of an apartheid, ethnocentric state? So how do you get that point across to audiences, non-Muslim audiences of different levels of education and background on that?
I think, like you said, really it is about stressing how Palestine is not a religious issue, and it's not something, which means, it's not something which is only relevant to Muslims. I mean, it's not a Muslim issue. It's an issue of all humanity, and it's a human rights issue which is relevant to us all. One of the things which should be stressed is that, of course, not all Palestinians are Muslim. This is where Christianity came from, so it would be ridiculous if there weren't any Christians. It's a small proportion of the population, a quite small proportion of the population, but they are there, and they are not treated any better by the Israelis. It's nothing to do with it. They don't say, oh, you're Christian, okay, well then I'll treat you fine. You can stay in your home and it'll be all fine, and we'll protect your human rights. No, forget it. It's nothing to do with the fact that you're Muslim or Christian. It's because you're Palestinian and you're on the land which they covet. So that's why they treat you poorly. So that's why they violate your human rights. So it's it's not a Muslim issue as such. It's an issue for all humanity. The other thing, and we see that, of course, with like I said, all the groundswell of support in a lot of Western countries. Most of these people out on the streets are not Muslims. many, like in the United States in particular, there are many progressive Jewish organizations that have come out and been very, very vocal and very, very proactive in their protests. A Jewish group like took over Grand Central Station in New York. I think perhaps people might have seen that on TV, and also protesting in the Capitol in Washington D.C. and in many, many different places. So they've been very vocal about that kind of thing. It's not just Muslims that feel strongly about this. And when you look at what's happening in Gaza now, I mean, if you're a human being, it's impossible not to feel strongly about this. Children pulled out from under the rubble. I mean, this is just, any human being knows that this is wrong. I think this is just instinctive to our common humanity. Nobody can look at this and say, yeah, but they're terrorists. Of course not. It's ridiculous. And I think, it's about sort of, asking people to sort of remove their shades, if you like, and the sort of colored lenses in which they look at this, and just look at what's going on. Again, children pulled out from under the rubble, whole families wiped out, UN schools, hospitals, everything. So it's really, I think it's about appealing to people's, common humanity. The other thing that I do want to say is one of the reasons that Western governments are so enamored with Israel. Of course, it's much, much worse since this time around than it ever has been. And there are all sorts of different factors to that, I think. But one of the things I truly believe is that to many Western governments, especially since 9/11, they look at Israel as the model security state, completely modeled on, quote-unquote security, surveillance everywhere, no room for any kind of dissent if you are from the sort of minority oppressed group. And Israel has, they since 9/11, they have gone around and sold themselves as the number one security consultant. We know how to do this. We know how to oppress a population and manage a conflict. So it's like, no problem here. And we know how to do this. And, American cops that, brutally oppress black populations in the United States, they are trained in Israel. A lot of these American police chiefs and what have you, they're trained in Israel on, on all these kind of, crowd control tactics and all this kind of thing. They probably didn't need Israeli training to be racist, but, the point is, this is part and parcel of how Western governments see the whole picture, right? Israel's economy is completely based on the colonization of Palestine and on military stuff. You hear about these high-tech startups and all this kind of thing, and, some of these technologies are impressive, but the overwhelming majority of these they're technologies which are developed by the military. And then after these guys leave the military, they use them in civilian, they sort of tweak them and use them for civilian use, right? And the security industry is very much, I don't know if I say dominated, but yeah, I mean some parts of it are very much dominated by Israeli companies, cybersecurity. And we've seen how certain Israeli companies have been used by real baddies all over the world to survey their dissidents. So for a lot of countries, they look at Israel and say, "Wow, we want to be able to do this. This is great." And in fact, unfortunately, a lot of the Arab countries that got really cozy with Israel, this was a process that really started heavily after the so-called Arab Spring, because they realized they were not as much in control of their populations as they wanted to be. They're like, well, the Israelis, they know how to do this. They know how to survey populations, and they know how to control them, and they know the buttons to press. So this is why, well, I mentioned Western governments, but a lot of governments are enamored with Israel, and they look to Israel as a model. And that's just another reason that the 7th of October was such a big tidal wave, a big earthquake for the Israelis. Because here they are, the ultimate security consultant, they know how to do things, and it turns out, whoa, what's going on here? It turns out these the half-starved, impoverished people in Gaza figured out, how to do this, how to coordinate these attacks in a really effective, efficient way. This involved, I have no idea, but it must have involved months and months of planning. And like I said, you got Israeli drones going overhead, and they know where all the Hamas people are, and all the time. So, somehow they managed to escape from the surveillance and use, underground tunnels. They didn't. I understand they didn't use mobile telephones. They used landlines that they put in the tunnels. I don't really know exactly what they did, but somehow they must have done something right, because they were effective in doing this. And this was the emperor being shown with no clothes, right? So, all these countries are looking at Israel as the ultimate conflict management expert, and they're like, well, maybe these guys don't really know what they're doing. So and that's another reason I believe that Israel has been reacting in such a violent way, because they got to regain their credibility in their eyes. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly part of it. Because they realize now they've lost their marketing brand.
Three short questions. I think I remember about 8 years ago when a former, at that time she was a former U.S. Congresswoman, Cynthia McKenzie, and she told us in a big gathering, maybe about 200-300 people, where she clearly stated two things. When she became a House of Representative in the U.S., one is a support and allegiance to the State of Israel for all the actions as a member of the Congress. But secondly, what surprised me was also that the U.S. government guarantees the cost of Jews from Europe and America to settle in those settlements. That is one question. Just to confirm, or if you have any comments. Secondly, there was a lot of information going around that DNA testing in Israel is banned. It's not allowed because 90% of them of the citizens are, as you mentioned, Europeans and from America. So, and most of them have dual citizenship. One of the military experts was saying that if you create a serious enough problem, everyone will run away, back to because they have a dual citizenship. So that is the second question. And the third question is really the role of Christian Zionism. I think the statement by Dr. Stephen mentioning that 90% of the Zionists are Christians, 10% are So the impression that I get is that is the key support for Israel. One day attack, 3 days later you have Biden coming down, and Blinken and all that, coming down, sending of the warships and so on. So is it outlandish for me to say if U.S. doesn't support Israel, it would collapse?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I should I just answer the, yeah. Okay, so a lot of different questions here. Of course, I don't know what that congresswoman signed. Also, she said that the funding, I doubt that it would be funded by the government in a direct sense, but many charities in the United States operate. They gather money, and this is the United States. We're talking lots of money. We're not talking, like in Japan, you have a charity. People donate, 1,000 yen, which is like $7 now. in the United States, you're talking, millions and millions of dollars. It's just, completely different sort of stratosphere here. But we have, they have these charities that collect money for the colonies, that collect money for the settlements. And these are in fact not eligible to be treated as charities. They should be paying taxes like a political organization under US law. But, what former tax officials and political and politicians and such have said is that we were just told, just don't go for those organizations. Just forget it. Just let them do whatever they want. And it was a very sort of political decision coming down on the civil servants, telling them not to pursue those cases. So, I think that's probably what she was referring to. Now, nobody knows how much money goes from the United States to Israel, really. I mean, it's because it's not just the government money. The government money is relatively easily, ascertained because it's public funds. But these charities you have, and then you have individuals donating to particular Israeli, organizations. A lot of this is sort of, it's not, it's sort of under the radar. It's not something which is public information. Sheldon Adelson, whether he's not with us anymore, but he used to donate untold millions, to all these sort of various sort of, Zionists. I don't know if anybody really knows how much he would donate. I don't know, if you really had to tell anybody. So nobody really knows. But I think what the best sort of guesstimate is that Israel relies on the United States government and private funding for 10% of its GDP. So should the United States cut that off? Yes, it will collapse. It will collapse the next day. And what's really infuriating is, or what's sort of amazing, is this unwillingness within U.S. policymakers to use this as leverage to push Israel into doing anything. And I've heard that from people in the know, like in Washington, D.C., who say it's unbelievable how, all these sort of congressmen and everything, they are convinced that you can't sort of push the Israelis into doing anything. You have to be nice to them, and you have to let them do whatever they want. And then maybe, after you do that for a while, you sort of come up with, maybe you could do this if you're be really nice to this. And this is nonsense. I'm sorry. The only time the Israelis have ever sort of given way was when the Americans said, you do this now or else. And, there have been very few occasions when this happened, but it has happened. It happened with Bush Sr., for example, with the settlements. No, you cut this off, and that's it. You do it now. And that's the only way. That's really the only way. This kind of kid gloves thing simply does not work with the Israelis. It's funny because, the Israelis and, from the early Zionist age, were very fond of saying that, force is the only language that the Palestinians will understand. And in fact, we see this now. I mean, I can't remember if it was Netanyahu now, but perhaps it was. I mean, one of the Israeli political leaders was just recently saying that force is the only language that Hamas understands. So that's why we're, destroying hospitals and killing babies, right? But, honestly speaking, force, not so much, military force, but being is kind of forceful assertiveness really is the way to communicate with the Israeli government. This is what the only time that the Americans have got any concessions from is when they did that. Do this now or else. And, really the Americans have to use their leverage. I very much believe that the solution will not come from within Israeli society. I think it will come only from within American society. And it will happen. The writing is definitely on the wall. There really is no question in my mind about it. If you look at the Zionist oppression of, pro-Palestinian advocacy and speech in various sort of spaces in the U.S., governments, obviously, but also, the state governments as well, universities, really terrible. But they're doing this in a really violent way because they see they're losing. They see that they are losing really bad. When I was as a child and growing up as a child, I was middle school, in the United States. And of course, this is a long time ago. This is in the 80s. But, the early 80s, the notion that American university students would hold, events damning Israeli apartheid. That there would be Israeli apartheid weeks in universities in America. It was inconceivable. It is simply inconceivable. You just couldn't imagine it. But now it is everywhere. Pretty much all universities have this. And now they're really trying to crack down on it. Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, which is a very prominent student activist group, they're being banned in some universities. We'll have to see if that really holds up in court. But in private universities, probably it would be possible. I don't know. But, they're really being very sort of violent, not in the sense of shooting people, but they're being very sort of oppressive in going about this. But it's because they see they're losing. I mean, this is what you do when you see you're losing the argument. You try to shoot the messenger, right? And the whole International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, this is very, very dangerous. And they've been propagating it, and a lot of the Western governments have adopted it. And again, they're really trying hard to stamp out any criticism of Israel. But they're doing it because they see they've lost. Really, they've lost. And with what's happening now I really believe it is irreversible. They're going to lose. Now, Christian Zionism, I don't know about 90%. I know that Stephen was saying 90% and 10%. He's the expert, so if he says that, it must be right. Certainly, the Christian Zionists in America and also the UK and in various other countries as well, they really are the driving force right now. Yes. And, like in Japan, a lot of people still believe that, they know that America supports Israel no matter what. And they, a lot of my students, they come with this idea that it's the Jewish vote in the United States. And I tell them, no, it is not the case. The Jewish population in America is not so large. It can't really sway the vote in too many places, perhaps Florida, but still not. It's not that deciding. And in any case, most American Jews, first of all, they tend to be on the liberal side, so they'll vote for the Democrats. And the other thing is that many of them have a sort of general affinity with Israel, but they're not, they're not, they don't believe that Israel should be supported no matter what it does. And again, we see, especially with young Jews now in America, we see how they really have grown disgusted with these atrocities committed by Israel. And Israel is constantly trotting out saying, we're the Jewish state. So any criticism of us means you're criticizing the Jewish people. And so that's anti-Semitic. Give me a break. But, and a lot of Jews in the United States and elsewhere are they've had it with it. They don't accept it. And that's why, a lot of these Jewish groups, I see a lot of placards saying, not in my name. They've been saying this. And in fact, one could argue that kind of, what propagation by the Israelis is actually, just fuel the fire for anti-Semitism. So it actually has the opposite effect. But these Israeli political leaders, they don't care. As long as it's good for them, and if it means more more Jews come to Israel from the West, well, it's even better for them. So they think. I guess that's a thought process. But yes, the Christian Zionists really are the driving force right now. And it, in terms of votes, of course, because we're talking about huge numbers of people in America. Nobody really knows how much, but they claim it can be from 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of the United States. That's clearly an overestimation. And not all of those people would, of course, vote for Israel under any circumstance. But the point is that, it's a very large proportion of the population that identifies themselves with this idea. And it's frightening. The Zionists have allied themselves with very virulent anti-Semites from the get-go. You know, the Balfour Declaration issued by the government of the UK. You know, the guy who wrote it, Balfour, a high-ranking British politician, is very well known for hating Jews. The idea was, yeah, we kick them out, and they're going to go to Palestine, and, you know, we don't have to see them anymore. You know, I'm more than happy not to see the Jews around here. They were, in fact, this is, truth is stranger than fiction, the Zionists were actually, you know, forging the possibility of having deals with the Nazis before, you know, before World War II, in the 30s, because they understood, okay, all these Jews are going to, there's going to be a big exodus from Germany, so they're, you know, we'll make sure they come to Palestine. So, and now we see the same thing. Christian Zionists, I mean, you know, I'm generalizing here, but the Christian Zionist philosophy is that, you know, the Jews are all going to go back to Israel, and they're going to have the Armageddon, the final battle with the unbelievers, these are the Muslims, of course, in the minds of these guys, and, you know, and then they're all going to kill each other, and the Jews that remain are going to convert to Christianity, and then the Messiah is going to come down, and then all the Christians are going to go up to heaven, and it's the end of the world. And, you know, I maybe don't ask me to explain this, but you know, this is what it's about. And so, you know, they're not supporting Israel because they love the Jewish people. You know, they're looking forward to this biblical prophecy to, you know, come to reality. They want the end of the world, and this is really very frightening stuff. I mean, when you look, you know, Trump, of course, was a complete airhead, but some of the guys surrounding him, like what was that guy's name, Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, and Payne, also the Vice President. These are committed Christian Zionists. You know, they wanted the end of the world. I mean, I don't know how else to say this. You know, that's how crazy this kind of thing is. But, you know, that's where this comes from. And so, you know, allying with these people is very odd, to say the least. Of course, you know, you could also argue it's pragmatic because, you know, they're allies and who cares. But, you know, in the long run, this is going to come back. And the same with many right-wing governments in Europe now, like the Hungarians, the Poles. They're very pro-Israel, again, because they see Israel as a security state and an ethnocratic state. And they think this is fantastic. Yeah, we don't want these Arab refugees and stuff in our country, and we're going to do like the Israelis do. We're just going to make sure they don't come. We're just going to kick them out. That's what we're going to do. And, you know, we're going to be like the Israelis. So there's this very sort of unholy alliance here. And they're very anti-Semitic as well. They hate Jewish people just like anybody. But, you know, the Israeli government has been really sort of forging ties and alliances with very, very
Okay, so thank you, Prof. Sincerely, I regret having to cut the Q&A session. We can spend the whole night honestly mining the knowledge and experience of Prof. Takahashi. Unfortunately, I have to play the role of strict parent here. It is a weeknight, unfortunately. So with that, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda. I call upon Encik Jusni to provide Prof. Takahashi with a token of our appreciation, the least we can do to recompense the knowledge and experience shared with us tonight. Mr. Stanley Yong, if you can join us on stage as well. Mr. Stanley Yong is the president of, chairman of GBM. Eh? Yeah. Mr. Stanley Yong is the chairman of GBM, one of our co-organizers for tonight. And I would actually like to pass the microphone to Mr. Stanley Yong to close off the night with an address from himself.
Thank you, MC. Professor Saul J. Takahashi and pemimpin dan wakil-wakil dari IKRAM dan various NGOs, tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, salam sejahtera. And kesejahteraan is actually one of the most valuable things that now Palestine is looking after. So we are very glad to hear from Professor tonight. There are certain solutions that we can look into, but at the same time, let's bear in mind what actually Nelson Mandela had just said. There's no complete freedom if the Middle East is having this war. And together we can see that actually the war going on Russia and Ukraine has been actually taking something like 21 months without any solution at all. And there are of course certain figures behind who has been manipulating the entire situation whereby somebody is not going to have the political will to stop the war. So as actually now I can see the Palestinian war. And the killings in Palestine, within 19 days, is already over what the killings going on in Russia and Ukraine. So we can see the magnitude. And we cannot actually tolerate the kind of human disaster, or we call genocide, that's been going on in Middle East. Now, obviously the wealthier countries, unfortunately, America, the European Union, they have been actually taking advantage of all these kind of conflicts in the world. Look at how many wars that America have been involved with. And this is a very small world, according to what actually they thought. But now, I think they are taking pain. Because as long as the killings are being exposed, the 16,000 innocent civilians have been killed in the same small strip, which occupied something like an area of 15 km to by 40 km. This is actually something that in the human history is actually a very dark page. Nobody can tolerate, nobody can accept the kind of genocide going on. So we can see that the pressure from the third world versus these so-called developed nations has to be actually strengthened, including Malaysia. So Malaysia has actually been mengakui kan keutamaan kesejahteraan dalam Palestine. And this is actually the spirit that we're talking about. We have to help in whatever area that we can to bring peace back to Palestine. And at the same time, we should work some strategies together with international Islamic organizations, so to say, in keeping certain magnitude of this war under control. The immediate thing that we can think of is, what about the importation of Israel? Israel has been importing quite a lot of things, including petroleum and even wheat, makanan. Yeah? If we can actually unite together and tell the Palestinians, you're going to continue this kind of killing in Palestine, we're going to stop supplying you petroleum. We're going to stop supplying wheat. Would that be actually help? I think that may help. And at the same time, in the G7, there's already a resolution saying that actually, look, America, you have been providing all the aids, like what Professor just said, to fuel the war in a magnitude whereby we can't even see the end of the war. Please do something. You know, this is actually not acceptable. And you can see that there's already a crack within the European Union, whereby some countries see the effect and they have to do something because the whole world is putting the pressure on their shoulders. The whole world is putting pressure on United Nations, United Kingdom, United States. So much so that you can see that United States, who have been actually controlling the whole world like a world police, they are losing the kind of influence. They are losing the kind of dignity. They are losing respect from the rest of the world. Would they be able to tolerate, would they be able to stand this kind of pressure? I think it is something that we can think of. And first of all, you can see that Asian countries are actually terribly sick of this kind of war going on in the north and even in the Middle East. And we don't want that kind of thing happening because this is against humanitarian. At the same time, this is against the brighter side of the growth and the development of the world. Regardless of whether you are a Muslim, you are non-Muslim, you're Buddhist or Christian, we are the owner of this world. And you start to occupy places without any good reason. Displacement of Palestine from one place to the other, this is actually ridiculous. This is worse than, I don't know what to call it. It's something like warriors that do not have even the simple humanity in the mind. And I actually find it very difficult to understand why the Jews themselves have been divided, but yet the good category of the Jews could not even control the bad one. Netanyahu, look at him. He's a very brilliant fellow. I've been actually respecting him for some time for building up the nation that's supposed to be owned by them. Supposed only, because you read back to the history, you know how Israel, this country was formed, and why this piece of land was actually given to them to share their dignity as a, what we call a race that already born in this world, and they have to be given a place to live, they have to be given a place to continue their civilization. We actually have been doing a lot of things that we can do. Much that actually we can actually respect wherever they are. They are equally as other human beings in the world, other races in the world. But at the same time, they've forgotten that they have actually the responsibility to keep peace, to keep the kind of civilization continue on in that part of the world, which now is affecting everybody. If this is to continue, and nobody is going to stop that, and nobody can stop that kind of war, can you imagine? We are now about having something like more than 10,000 years of civilization, being human beings on this earth. How would we are able to face the future generation if this generation is not going to stop this war with our means and with our wisdom and with our willpower? You can't face the younger generation. Yeah. My boy Juju was just born about 10 days ago. And when every time I look at him, I said, you're very glad that you live in this country where Malaysia is peaceful. But there are certain parts of the world, those who are of your same age, 10 years old, 10 days old, I'm not 10 years, 10 days old, he's still in the hospital at the moment. I'm not enjoying that kind of warmth, that kind of peace, that kind of living standard that we are talking about here, which actually is supposed to be affordable for every human being in this world. But yet, there are those who are 10 years old, 8 years old, 6 years old, 4 years old, who are being killed without any valid reason. Innocent situation where innocent civilians have been killed. And every time you look at the video, you actually cannot sleep. Because you don't know why the human being against human being can be that brutal and can be that actually inhuman. And we have to see that ceasefire, bring back peace, let the world enjoy our growth of civilization. Property is the only thing that is actually more important than any of the other factors that we can actually achieve. And I thanks very much that the gentleman next to me, Professor Saul, Takahashi, he has been talking to a lot of people, and I have to check his background. He has been actually telling the whole world as much as he can for the protection of Palestine. Well done. And it's my privilege and the privilege of everybody who is able to meet him in person and listen to his talk. And I wish him good luck, and I wish him all the effort that he can spare. Please do it within these few more days. The peace, so-called humanitarian pause, have been just entered on Thursday last week. And look at the Friday bombing. Another close to 1,000 civilians have been killed. This is actually nonsense, isn't it? And I cannot understand what kind of so-called soul, S-O-U-E-U-L, soul. What kind of soul they have in heart? Orang tak ada soul lah, macam itu. Mengapa itu macam itu? Kita tak boleh tahan. And this is actually the darkest page that I can see in the human world. And I hope everybody in Malaysia, please tell the unity government, regardless of what kind of pressure that United States Embassy have been talking to us, we only say that we have to keep peace. We have to stop Israel from bombing. At the same time, we did not say that Hamas is a terrorist. We have not seen that. We have not said that at all. But we will keep an eye on both parties. Because if one side stops, the other side is still continuing the kind of fight, the kind of conflict, the conflict will continue. So we have to talk to both sides, please. If there's anything that we can do on the table, if there's anything that can back up this ceasefire, please tell the world. Let the world do their part. And we will be the police behind, making sure these two parties actually behave themselves. And that will only be able to guarantee the kind of peace, the kind of life back to the normal for the entire Palestine. So thank you very much for your presence today. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful, Mr. Sani Yong. Thank you for voicing our conscience. And indeed, we find ourselves in a dark page of human history, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. We can see it. And we will keep fighting for it. So, Murphy's Law, And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our event for tonight. On behalf of IKRAM, GBM, the Hashim Sani Center for Palestinian Studies, and myself, I once again thank everyone for joining us. Sincere apologies also for any mistakes committed along the way. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Thank you and have a safe journey home, everyone. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم بأسمائك الحسنى وصفاتك العلى أعد المسجد الأقصى إلى رحاب المسلمين وارزقنا فيه صلاة قبل الممات اللهم انصر إخواننا المرابطين على أرض فلسطين اللهم انصر إخواننا المجاهدين في غزة كن لهم عونا ونصيرا اللهم آمن روعاتهم واشف جريحهم وارحم شهداءهم وتقبلهم عندك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام اللهم عليك باليهود اللهم عليك باليهود اللهم عليك باليهود الذين قتلوا أولاد ونساء المسلمين اللهم إنا نجعلك في نحور أعدائنا ونعوذ بك من شرورهم اللهم بدد شملهم وفرق جمعهم وشتت كلمتهم وزلزل أقدامهم وسلط عليهم كلبا من كلابك يا قهار يا جبار يا منتقم يا الله اللهم يا منزل الكتاب ويا مجري السحاب ويا هازم الأحزاب اهزمهم 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 وانصر المسلمين عليهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين